Good afternoon, everybody. How are you doing? We're going to continue in the theme of a lot of crisis in the world, and yet it's going to be a little different in that we're looking at converging crises. In that respect, all nations of the world really are interdependent. We have a global community, we have a global civic society, and what happens in Bangladesh impacts us in New York City, or what happens in Tokyo, Japan will impact what happens in terms of climate change, food insecurity, all those themes that we've been hearing throughout the day. So without further ado, we have a stellar group of people on the stage with me, and I'm going to be co-moderating with Dr. Titumir to my right, and he is also going to be the first speaker. And what I asked of each speaker is that you not really give a speech, but rather talk about these crises in convergence. And I'm going to begin with Dr. Titumir and then move to Dr. Fair from Georgetown University, Dr. Simons, who is coming here from Sweden, or perhaps Poland. I'm not sure where you are. You're always on the move. My friend who flew in with me yesterday from Japan, Dr. Satoru Nagao, who is a non-resident fellow at the Hudson Institute. And last but not least, Dr. Trigunayat, who is a former ambassador of India. Very nice to meet everybody. I'm rather intimidated. So I'm going to now give up to 5 minutes, again, remarks, and begin with Dr. Titumir.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, CGS, for inviting us to this session. It's really wonderful to have your presence. So the premise you have heard from Nancy, does that really constitute the full picture of it? So I would rather argue that three issues would really tell us that the way we formulate the narrative may not convey the kind of message that we want to share. So these would, according to me, would focus on first the causation, second the data, and the third the way particularly the international community wants to understand the narrative. I think they might be in a trap. So having said that, so the first one, that as if that the external crisis hit a nation and halts its progress, or the reversal is correct. If you were to look at, particularly in South Asia, and as a student of economics, that I could understand that the manifestation of the crisis, be it food crisis, climate crisis, financial crisis, or anything to do with, if you look at Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, what we see is basically the crisis in the political settlement that leads to that outcome. And I could go on to establish my reasoning. Rather, this international crisis allows them to hide behind or conceal behind the failure of their political system. So that's one thing, because the way it looks as if that there are not structural rigidities, there are not risk or vulnerabilities pre-COVID years or during COVID or with the ensuing of the Ukraine conflict. So one has to really look at the cases of Sri Lanka, look at the case of Pakistan, and the second thing, which is really important, if you really look at their growth narrative, you would find, even if the data is questionable, that if there is a segment of a political settlement that tries to be accountable to its citizen, might have a acceleration of the positive points or the negative points. Say, if you are looking at Bangladesh data 1991 to 2005, what you see that obviously according to the government data, you see that the rate of declining in poverty is accelerating, while you see the opposite after post 2005. Or if you look at the employment figure, and or if you look at the private sector investment and to GDP, all those back it. And same is the case with the Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's social development really was something enviable to the South Asian nations. But with the political settlement captured, and even in India, then that brings our second question. How are we producing data? If you remember, in case of India, if you really look at the employment figure, you have seen that National Statistical Agency's officer has to resign. And the Prime Minister office kept back data for quite some time. So how do you really look at and build the narrative based on data that lacks huge amount of credibility? And same applies in many countries. So that's the how without really evidence, how can you build a narrative? And then it backs to the last point, which I would finish because I would not take more. I would try to complete it by 4 minutes, and I can come back to illustrate my points if time permits. If you really look at the donors community or development partners or international community, they come up with a narrative to show their parliament, look, our tax dollar is bringing dividend. And then you come up with an idea of miracle, of surprise. Then when these economies cannot withstand any external shock, then what would you say? Then you hide behind, it's a paradox, or you hide behind and you say that it's a deficit, democratic deficit. So it's in that conundrum where they are, and now they can't do anything. And same happens because even in their own countries, what is happening is a minoritarian ruling the majoritarian. Look at the case of USA. Huge efforts going on because there are two ways of really amending US Constitution. One by Congress and Senate, the other by the states. And if 2/3 of the state agrees, then minoritarian would be ruling and making amendment to the US constitutions. So same applies with India, where you could see how Indian Foreign Service externalizing the debates that the domestic are having, what has never been seen by any Foreign Service official to take on international space a debate that is contested. But Indian Foreign Minister did it in UN General Assembly. So what is really important? It is obviously, the narrative is that obviously these countries are really on a fault line. COVID has exposed it. So if we are to really make a kind of a pathway, then obviously these countries were full of risks and vulnerabilities. Then COVID has exposed the fault line, so it has created downward pressures. And if the political settlement cannot really make a headway, then obviously it would create crisis. So the narrative that you see in Financial Times, that you see in many places, is really flawed. And it is flawed because the Anglo-Saxon way of really looking at it is really problematic. And if you are saying, yes, our tax dollar is giving us dividend, then you are end up in a situation where 30 years of progress are reversed. Look at the SDGs. So then what you say? You are in real problem. And that problem is biting them. So what we need to really look at is to be aspirational, allowing there is a public society that, because the state by definition is coercive. So how do you create an institution that puts accountability? And that has to be homegrown. And that is where I would stop.
Well, I'm going to now throw it to Dr. Fair, because we've gone well beyond converging crises to contested concepts about what kind of a crisis is this? So I welcome your input here into our dialogue.
I don't even know if it's working. Is it working? Okay. So, hi, I'm Chris Fair from Georgetown. So, before I make my comments, I want to thank the organizers of the conference for letting me be here and also for not having this be a manel. I also want to say that as an American, I am very much in disagreement with many of the things that my ambassador said. I find it really problematic as an American that the ambassador will hector others about democratic rights when democratic freedoms in my own country are under attack, even as I sit here enjoying this conference, right? So with what I'm going to say in the next several minutes comes from a position of humility and an understanding that many of the things that I'm about to criticize the region for are things that my own country does. And I'm not a nationalist, I'm an analyst, so I'm just going to lay it out as I see it. I do see the Bay of Bengal as a crucible for a number of intersecting crises, whether we're talking about the trafficking of weapons, narcotics, human beings, climate change. Obviously, there's been a lot of mention of it, but curiously, one of the most important panels, which was about maintaining the health of our forests, was sparsely attended, and it was only given 10 minutes in the course of this conference. Food insecurity, and I'm going to raise the issue of gender again. Women bear disproportionately the costs of all of these crises. Only half of us have vaginas, but we give birth to all of you, including those of you who don't. And so to continually see our views not represented by having panel after panel festooned with men without a single woman, this is part of the security challenge. You want security, you have to include women. And that means you have to listen to us. And this doesn't happen by having organizations put together panel after panel festooned with men. So what you're hearing is a lot of frustration in my voice. Thank you. It's 2022. In any organization that's putting on panels with just men, they're not doing a justice to the topic that they claim to be addressing. And it's also bad science, because the way you get good answers is by bringing in a diversity of opinions and a diversity of views. And women experience these crises very different than men do, okay? So having said this, putting my analyst hat back on, as I look about the Bay of Bengal, virtually every single country that's a member or a partner of the Bay of Bengal, of course, not every country is represented here. I haven't seen anyone from Myanmar or Thailand. What I see is a very frightening, disturbing set of commonalities. First of all, democracy is retrenching. Whether we're looking at India, whether we're looking at Bangladesh, obviously, Myanmar. Countries such as India that once claimed to be one of the oldest democracies, I'm sorry to say, is making serious retrenchments from democracy, just as my country is the oldest democracy. And what we see setting up around the Bay of Bengal and reaching down into Sri Lanka is a strange sort of electorally competitive, but nonetheless authoritarian state with the ascension of religious nationalists and the rule of majoritarians at the expense of the minorities. So whether you're looking at being Muslim or less so, but still important in India, a Christian, or whether you are looking at being a Christian or a non-Muslim in Bangladesh, or a non-Buddhist in either Myanmar or Sri Lanka, the details differ, but the trends are very similar. So if we're going to talk about green governance, we actually have to have good governance. And the countries around the Bay of Bengal are not exactly converging on that. They are instead converging upon sort of ethno-nationalist / religious fascism that caters to the desires and demands of majorities who somehow have convinced themselves that their ways of life and culture are under threat. As an American, I'm living through this as well. Somehow white Americans have convinced themselves that they're the real victim of the American historical project. And of course, that's not true at all. And while these countries around the Bay of Bengal are retrenching to these peculiar forms of authoritarianism, we have a really significant set of problems within the Bay of Bengal. And you know, there's at least one country who stands to terribly benefit from the lack of good governance in this region, and that's China. China has made no secret that it wants to set up an alternative order based upon Chinese principles and Chinese values. And I think we've all seen the Chinese values and principles at play in places like Tibet and Xinjiang, right? China is very interested in taking advantage of this space to try to forge new sea lanes of control and communication that have nothing to do with financial arrangements, because many of the slots that they have set up are not actually economically viable. These are strategic. So I would like to make an appeal in the few minutes that I have that we really try to understand and even reverse the retrenching of democracy that we see not only in this region, but also in Europe. I'm kind of puzzled that the president of Serbia is I'm not sure, the chief guest of this conference. That itself is an interesting choice. But we have democracy retrenching all across the world. And so the Bay of Bengal is just, I would say, a subset of what is proving to be a global phenomenon. It also, I think, highlights the inviability or the inefficacy of these alphabet soups of acronyms that we've heard so much about this morning. But I would even say the United Nations itself. If you look at the composition of the United Nations, we have 2 members of the UN Security Council that are not interested in a global order, much less upholding it. And that is, of course, Russia and China. So we're sitting here in Bangladesh, in Dhaka. To our south, we have one of the largest humanitarian crises, which is also spawning other crises, such as a massive environmental destruction in Cox's Bazar, and I'm talking about the Rohingya. And we can't do anything about the Rohingya because the Chinese basically thwart any effort at the UN Security Council, and they are assisted by their co-vetoers, the Russians. And, you know, the United States itself is a really terrible leader on the UN Security Council because it thwarts any action against its client, Israel. So when you have major world states like the members of the UN Security Council using this forum to basically engage in the protection and the promotion of their pet projects, what kind of global governance is this? So I'm going to end with those remarks and see what happens next.
I'm going to now ask Dr. Simons to, give your perspective, Eastern European in particular. Thank you.
So I will go about things a bit differently, a bit more critical of what we have currently, this geopolitical transformation, which is taking the world away from this Western-centric US unipolar world to a more non-Western-centric multipolar world. And whenever you have a transformation as this, there is inevitably conflict and competition because no hegemon wants to willingly give up its power and influence. And I mean, this region knows exactly this history when you have a declining hegemon in your region. So, I mean, I see crises, a whole lot of them, in different ones, and they're becoming increasingly interconnected. And they have not happened just in the last couple of years. These have been building. But I would ask the question, why are they building? What is the underlying condition which is driving this increasing competition and conflict around the world? And I'd say at the base of it, there is an increasing division between the Western and non-Western world. And this is based on the Western world becoming much more entrenched in a theoretical and an ideological worldview. And the non-Western world is engaged in what I'd more refer to as operational pragmatism. So that is to resolve things on a practical basis. And we can see this, for example, at the state of so-called liberal democracy. For example, if we look at liberal democracy, this is an absolute microcosm of this problem, because if we look at the word and the practice, these are quite differing. We have liberalism as an ideological function, which is being promoted at the expense of democracy. And we can see this currently. I mean, we've seen it in the coronavirus pandemic. What were all those nice EU values about rule of law and individual human rights? They meant nothing. They're on paper, they're theoretical. But when push came to shove, the ideology and the theory won. And this is this idea what the West is trying to use to try and perpetuate its power and its system of hegemony. And this is what I'd call to create, they're using information as the fifth dimension of strategy. That is to create this idea of orthodoxy of knowledge. That is a one truth, if you like. And this one truth of the world, this is based on a form of coercion. I mean, India knows this well, considering the US pressure on its position on the Ukraine war as one expression. So you're having this coercion to create conformity, and conformity is used to create consensus. And consensus, the only problem with that, just because maybe everyone agrees that a certain thing is true or not, doesn't mean they're right. It just means everyone agrees on a certain point. And it's getting exposed even more. I mean, especially if we look at the state of ideology within the EU, where you have the so-called head of European Union diplomacy, when he started talking about the European garden as opposed to the jungle. I mean, what I think I prefer to be in the jungle than the garden at the moment. This reminds me of a Turkish proverb. If you put a clown in the palace, it does not make him a king. It makes the palace a circus. And I mean, this is the state of things. And if we look at what's happening, I mean, this whole idea the world is against Russia about Ukraine. The Western world is against Russia on Ukraine for the reasons which I just outlined. And you're getting this pressure to conform. And if we're looking at these issues of application versus do what I say, not what I do, we can have a look at the basic premise of the US about Ukraine, because if we are to be blunt, Ukraine is the mechanism. It's not what the whole fight is about. The fight is much larger, and this is coming into shaping or trying to prevent this emerging new world order, which I do not think is a deglobalization, but rather a reglobalization. So this is where I'd contradict a number of the other speakers, because the idea is not to deglobalize, but to co-opt the globalization, because this is about power and influence, where geoeconomics feeds into geopolitics and it supports the system. But I better leave here before I blow Nancy's timeline.
Again, it's very noticeable that amongst the three speakers we've had so far, there's been so much discussion about the language, the rhetoric, the narrative, the way we present the way things are. So how perspectives compete, impact how we even identify a crisis. So I'm going to ask our last two speakers to speak, and then I'm going to turn the moderating over to Dr. Titumir so that we can continue the conversation. So Dr. Nagao, please.
Thank you very much. Yes, we need to talk about crisis. But if we face a crisis, wow, bad future will come. But that's not true, I think, because crisis can be the chances if we deal with properly. So currently, one of the most important crises is US-China competition. So which side is the beneficial is the matter, I think, because winner side will get the benefit. So I need to analysis the US-China competition and which side will win. In the simply said, America is allowed to win the competition with China because of the three reasons. Firstly, America is still powerful. When we check the military expenditure, American military expenditure is 3 times bigger than China's. And when we check the equipment, Chinese submarine mainly is a conventional powered, but Americans were nuclear powered. And when even if the GDP is the same, China try to catch up, and maybe it will happen. But in this case, when we check the population, American population is 1/4 of China. So this means that when we compare the GDP per capita, Americans are 4 times bigger. So in this case, we can say America is powerful. And when we check the ally, this is very important. Number of ally is one of the important factors which side will win the competition. The last 3 competitions that has happened. World War I, winner side with 32 countries, loser side only 4. World War II, 54 countries was a winner, but loser 8. And in US-Soviet Cold War, 54 versus 26. So now we need to check the treaty-based formal allies. America has 52 if we include Taiwan. In this case, India is partner, not the treaty-based ally, but still America has 52. How many allies China has? Only 1, North Korea. So 52 versus 1. Obviously, American has the advantage. And when we check the history, yes, Americans say they have only the 246 years history, but if this is right, you can remember what happened 246 years ago. America is just one of the colony of the British Empire. We can see the only one superpower now. Their system is very effective to get the power to win the competition. And when we check, all of the rival last 246 years has gone, including Germany, Japan, my country, and the Soviet Union. So we can say America is allowed to win the competition. So under such kind of situation, we should be the winner. Japan should be the winner. Of course, Bangladesh should be winner. For Bangladesh, what kind of benefit we can expect? For example, we need to focusing on the one word, friend sharing. Friend sharing, what is it? Simply said, the US side do not want to rely on Chinese market or China's supply chain, etc., so-called economic security. In this case, US side countries want to relocate their factories from China to other countries. If Bangladesh will be the main destination, when the US side country change their factories, relocate from China to, so in this case, Bangladesh can get the benefit. When the China suggests the Sonadia port project, Japan suggests the Matabari port project, and Bangladesh finally choose Matabari port project instead of Sonadia port project of China. That was a great decision. Bangladesh should continue such kind of decision. It will be the beneficial. It will be the winner in the US-China competition. That is what I want to say. And that is a good cause, I think. So Japan and Bangladesh will be the friend. In the US side, it's the best, I think. Thank you very much.
And I to ask former Ambassador Dr. Trigunayat to bring us to the first round, and then I'll hand over to the duties here.
Thank you, Chair. I must thank my friend Zillur Rahman for bringing me here after 32 years when I served in Bangladesh for the first time. Well, when we talk of the convergence of crises, nearly everything has been said by my colleagues. So let me just expostulate a few things that will or are being reflected in each of our countries and globally as well. When the pandemic came here, we may call it man-made, we may call it natural, but when the pandemic came, certain things were very clear. That it had a debilitating impact on every nation. It is continuing to have it even today. It has exposed the vulnerabilities. So what we all have to really address, whether we want it or not, which I put as 4H. H stands for hunger. A lot of countries are suffering from that. H stands for habitat. We're talking of climate change, and the COP27 perhaps was a wasted exercise. You might see the COP28 being the same. Because what happens is when the biggest polluter or the biggest power under a precedent decides to walk out of the Paris Agreement, does not even agree, then you can imagine what would the others do. So that is the kind of situation. And then we have to see health, H. That is our major concern. When we talk of SDGs, nearly all our problems are combined in that. But the SDGs have taken a backseat. Nobody is, except in conferences, nobody is bothered about it because you're bothered about immediate problems that we are facing. And lastly, we'll have to talk about technology, H, high tech. We have to move into the world, whether we want it or not, is moving towards autonomous lives. It is the AI-driven Industrial Revolution 4.0, in which I'm sure our countries do not want to be left behind. And then comes on the back of it, now you can say whether pandemic was preventable. Yes, indeed it was. And we know a country kept a lot of information to it, did not share in time, did not happen. We also see in the climate and the pandemic something called vaccine apartheid, or for that matter, green apartheid. And that's very much prevalent on a day-to-day basis. And these are the situations that we have to confront as developing countries and as developed countries, because it's a common problem. In one of the panels I was listening to, they said, well, Bill Gates told them that, the developing countries need not do this or that. It is a common problem of the world. It's a universal problem. It cannot be that I sit back and say that I am not going to undertake my responsibility and I'll just palm it off onto others. It's a common cause. So that's where it is extremely important to agree to that. Then comes your Russia-Ukraine war. Was it preventable? Yes, indeed, it was. It could have been. It can stop today. American ambassador today said that if Russia stops today. I say if the Americans want to stop it, it can stop today. It's possible. The wars don't happen just like that. We have to learn to live together, find a modus vivendi. Unfortunately, that is not happening. And what is happening is we are faced with the 3F catastrophe: fuel, food, and fertilizers. Countries with large populations, and the area where we are sitting here, India, 1.4 billion people. Bangladesh, 800 million people, constitute more than 1/7 of the world. Include China, it becomes nearly 2/3. Now, those are countries which are suffering and will continue to suffer. What do we do in such a situation? We see that now President Xi Jinping has come back, was coronated third time. Earlier, everybody thought, even I believed, that China doesn't want a war. Sun Tzu philosophy, win a war without fighting it. Now, what did he say? He called his PLA and he said, you should be war ready. Fight a war and win it. Wolf warrior diplomacy, we are watching everywhere. Most of the countries have suffered from it. United States, on the other hand, is seeing that it has in China a competitor which might replace it from numero uno position, technologically, economically, or otherwise. China wants a breather for 10, 20 years to be able to compete there and be on the top of it. Do they want to give it? I don't see. So the way we saw the Eurasian war which is happening, and another point before I forget. Today I listened very carefully to my friend, American Ambassador, Peter Haas. He spoke about many of the things, but perhaps one omission was terrorism. Isn't it an existential problem for the world? And how did it come into being? Invasion of Iraq, invasion of Libya. You cannot forget and you can't take issue by issue only for deciding your policy choices. And then when a country like India says that we fight for peace, we fight for dialogue, we stand for diplomacy, we stand for the United Nations Charter, it is laughed at, scoffed at. So what we are looking at is, in my view, unfortunately what is happening is that whatever be the consequence of this war, it stops today, it doesn't stop, it becomes a frozen conflict. We are looking at Cold War 2.0 with a much worse implementation mechanisms. Because what we have seen in this war, we have seen nowhere, never. We have seen unilateral sanctions that we don't recognize, but all of us are impacted by them. What we are seeing today is the weaponization of financial instruments. A French member of Parliament was here in Delhi the other day. He was talking and he said, we are worried that a country's foreign exchange reserves are not made available to it. We think that tomorrow, if we are not on the same side, then we will also face the same music. That means erosion of trust in the liberal order, in the financial institutions, and that is a dangerous precedent because we all look up to those liberal principles and want to live by them. So when we talk of climate justice or social justice or anything like that, they are mere talks. Nobody means them. So we have to be practical. We have to look at the possibilities in an objective manner while making policy choices. So when I see the Cold War 2.0, in which on the one side you will have some, of course, transatlantic alliance itself is seeing somewhat of a break. But yesterday at the APEC summit, the Macron, president of France, maybe it was in the context of the submarine deal, but he said very clearly, we don't believe in hegemony. We don't believe in confrontation. We believe in stability. We are in the jungle and we have two big elephants trying to become more and more nervous. If they become very nervous and they start a war, it will be a big problem for the rest of the jungle. You need cooperation of a lot of other animals, tigers, monkeys, and so on. So this is the jungle Raj that we are looking at. And this will be a much worse kind of situation. What do countries like India do in that? I believe, I may be totally wrong, time has come for a very large number of countries to look at whether being on one side or the other helps you, or be a part of the strategic autonomy and leverage your strengths strategically. Thank you.
We have run out of time on our schedule, but if you all would like to maybe comment for a few final minutes, and I'm going to hand over the reins to you. But I don't want to keep you from your tea and coffee. These were really powerful statements from all of you, and I really greatly appreciate it. So what do you think? You want to maybe take a few more minutes and maybe have a little bit of a question or comment to each other. So,
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Nancy. So I was not really prepared to do this. Anyway, so what we would do in this round, and we would just really adhere to time, because some people have taken 5 minutes, 10 minutes, will not do it. So it's 1 minute, meaning 1 minute. So as we are looking at the title of the session, so there are convergence, and you are talking about contested convergence or conditional convergence or divergences. So let's really have a pinpointed 1 or 2 or 5 sentences, but not crossing more than 1 minute. I would really like to hear your views or challenge whatever you have heard from others. So I'll start from the left. So my Japanese colleague.
In this case, many variety of the crisis each speaker pointed out. So that's why which crisis is the most important if you choose which one is my question. And I have already choose US-China competition, but what is your answer? Is I want to hear for the world or for the Bangladesh.
Okay, next. Kristen.
Well, I don't have anything further to add.
Okay. Ambassador.
Well, the only thing I can say is that how do we work together? So I would say at one time we used to have Panchshila principles. Now I would say there are 5 S. First S is Samman, respect for one another. Second is Sambad, have a dialogue. Sahyog, cooperation. Shanti is for peace and is needed for Samriddhi, that is prosperity.
Thank you. Great.
Okay, just a few points that everyone is talking about this rules-based order, as it is called now. But if we go back 10 years, it did not refer to itself as the rules-based order. It referred to itself as an order based on international law. And this is an interesting distinction because a rule is not necessarily law. And we can see this playing out today. And I'd say that a number of these crises which are being faced at the moment are home goals. The food crisis, energy crisis, inflation, etc. I mean, if we look at the food crisis, while they're having a shortage of food, I mean, you got Western governments closing down farms, imposing taxes, decreasing food production. It does not go together. Energy crisis, well, the same thing here. You've got this ideology which was for green energy, but not creating energy that would replace nuclear power or other power sources, and also sanctions against Russia even before the war began. These are all decreasing energy sources at a time of energy crisis. So you can see here that these things are also inflated by, I would say, unwise government policy based on ideology rather than pragmatism.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a fantastic panel. We could at least say that there were pluralism in perspectives. So we upheld the proverbial phrase, which is unity in diversity. And definitely there are certain issues that really came in the course of discussion. One is that we have to really challenge, question, and ask, how do we really frame our discussion in terms of realism of various shades, or idealism of various shades, or liberalism of various shades? Because that really leads to how we perceive the world and how we analyze different contexts. So from deglobalization to a idea of a contested globalization, to that of now WEF providing a chair to the Chinese president to open the World Economic Forum, to many ideas. And so that's fantastic in the sense that we listen to how do we shape our perspective and build our scenarios in terms of understanding it. Secondly, what we see that there are certain operational issues that has not been addressed, and there are hardly that kind of a statesmanship. Rather, what we have witnessed is a kind of a brinkmanship, and that are sliding to certain degree of tipping points in terms of climate change, in terms of food, in terms of health emergencies, as has been said. And third point, which is also quite important, is to really understand that there is a kind of we live in an uncertain and unequal world where there are degree of differences, and the recovery path is not that of a VI, but rather it is taking of a K shape. So we have to engage ourselves in terms of understanding why this has happened. And the last point, which is quite important, when there are inequalities between the countries, there are also inequalities in terms of within the countries. So what we need is really have a perspective in a state of really looking at it and trying to justify it, rather to do the reasoning of it. So that's quite important, and that has really given us, I would finish with a ray of hope that at least we see in Sharm el-Sheikh, which is, if you translate, I'm not good at Arabic, but what it means is basically the Bay of Wise. So what we had there is a kind of certain movements, but this has not really provided us a livable earth. But what really strikes us and really allows us to move forward is the way the younger generation has come on it, and really making their headways and trying to really make sure that the statesmen, the politicians listen to them. And that's the ray of hope, that with that kind of a hope, we would complete this session. Thank you for being with us, and it was really an excellent session. In terms of myself, I have really benefited out of the perspectives that we heard, and it was really, we couldn't give them enough time. We are sorry for that, but definitely we would study their articles and we would benefit out of that process. Thank you once again. Thank you so much.